A dying man's last words to me weren't about his money. They were about a 6-year-old girl he lost track of in 1958, and a story I'd told him 3 weeks earlier without thinking twice about it. If I'd known what that one conversation was going to cost me, and what it was going to give me, I might have kept my mouth shut. My name is Daniel Wexler. I'm 39 years old. I live in a rented 2-bedroom off Secker Road in Toledo, Ohio, and for the last 11 years I've worked private duty hospice care. I'm good at it. Not in a sentimental way. I mean, I'm good at the actual job. Reading vitals nobody else catches. Knowing when a patient's pulling away versus when they're just tired. Sitting with people in the worst weeks of their lives and not flinching. Robert Kessler hired me through an agency back in November. 81 years old, congestive heart failure that had finally outrun every medication his cardiologist could throw at it, living alone in a stone and cedar house on a quiet street in Sylvania, just northwest of the city. The kind of neighborhood where the lawns are mowed in diagonal stripes and nobody's car is older than 3 years. Robert built his money in auto parts manufacturing back in the 70s and 80s, supplier contracts with the big three, plants in 3 states before he sold most of it off in his 60s. He didn't talk about the money much. What he talked about, especially toward the end, was Defiance, Ohio. That's a real town, about 60 miles southwest of Toledo, an hour's drive down Route 24 along the Maumee River. County seat, population around 16,000. Robert grew up there. So, it turned out, had my mother, at least the early part of her life, the part that came after whatever happened to the family she was born into. I didn't put any of that together until one Tuesday night in February. It was one of the long ones. Robert couldn't sleep, didn't want to be alone with it, and I'd pulled a chair up next to his bed because that's part of the job too, just being a person in the room. He'd been talking about his childhood, the way dying people sometimes do, looping back to places 50, 60 years gone like they happened yesterday. I had a sister, he told me, out of nowhere, staring at the ceiling. Linda, 6 years younger than me. You don't talk about her much. There's not a lot to talk about. We got separated. 1958, I was 13, she was 6. Family trouble, the kind nobody explains to a kid. They just hand you a different life and expect you to live it. He turned his head toward me. I never found out what happened to her after that. 68 years, Daniel. That's the one thing in my whole complicated life I never made right. I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say much of anything. Just nodded, let the quiet sit there with him for a minute. Then he asked, almost like it didn't matter, where's your mother's people from? Defiance, actually, small world. Is it? He wasn't looking at the ceiling anymore. He was looking at me. Brower was her maiden name. She didn't talk about it much either. Grew up in foster care down there. Family fell apart when she was small. We never got the full story. Robert Kessler went very quiet. I didn't think anything of it that night. Dying men get quiet a lot. You learn not to read too much into every pause. But 3 days later he brought it up again. And 3 days after that. By the 3rd week of February, he wasn't just bringing it up anymore. He was building something out of it. I remember the afternoon clearly. I was checking his oxygen levels, routine stuff, and he asked, like he was just making conversation. Your mother. What was her name before she married? Linda. Linda Wexler now. Brower growing up. I clipped the line to his finger, didn't think much of the question. She died when I was 17. Even before that she didn't like talking about the early years. His hand started shaking. Not the heart failure kind of shaking. Something else. Born around 1952? He asked. I think so. Yeah, somewhere around there. Why? He didn't answer. Just shook his head slightly, like he was trying to clear something out of it, and told me he was tired, that we'd talk later. We didn't talk later. Not that night. But 2 days after that, he asked me to call his attorney. His attorney was a man named Bruce Tannehill, 58, heavyset. A downtown Toledo office on Madison Avenue, and a handshake that's a little too firm, like he's trying to convince you of something before he's said a word. I'd met him twice before for routine paperwork. This time, Robert asked me to leave the room while they talked, which he'd never done before. When I came back 40 minutes later, Robert looked wrecked in a way that had nothing to do with his heart. Once Bruce had gone, he finally explained it. I asked him to draw something up. Not a will change. I need you to understand that part. It's not a will change. Okay. Then what is it? A letter of intent. Notarized, he had to stop and catch his breath before he could keep going. Saying what I think, what I believe, based on a name and a hometown and a timeline that's been keeping me up at night, is that you might be connected to the sister I lost in '58. And saying that before $1 of my estate gets distributed to anybody, I want that looked into properly. Dina. Records. In front of a judge. I sat there with the oxygen concentrator humming in the corner and thought, this man is dying and he's decided I'm the answer to something. I didn't know whether to be moved or terrified. Turned out it was both. Robert, I don't want anything from you. That's not why I'm telling you any of this. His answer came back sharper than I expected. I know that. That's exactly why it has to be you. His voice dropped quieter. I should have fixed this 30 years ago. I had the money. I had investigators. I told myself there'd be time. There wasn't time. That's the thing about telling yourself there'll be time. It's never guaranteed, and Robert Kessler, for all his money, didn't get any more of it than anybody else. The letter was signed and notarized 2 days later, Tuesday the 3rd of March, right there in his living room, with a notary Bruce brought to the house and 2 witnesses, a hospice volunteer named Carl who happened to be visiting, and Robert's longtime housekeeper. I watched him sign it. His hand was steady for exactly as long as it took to get his name down, and then it wasn't steady again. There was one clause in that letter I didn't understand the weight of until much later, a clause Robert insisted on himself, over Bruce's objections, according to what the notary later told investigators. Why 96 hours? I asked him, after the notary had left. Why not just let it go through probate the normal way? Because I've watched 2 families I knew get torn apart by years of court fights over exactly this kind of thing. His voice was firm despite everything. Lawyers dragging it out because dragging it out is how they get paid. I don't want that for you. I want it resolved fast, while the trail's still warm, before anybody has time to turn it into a circus. 4 days. That's what he decided his entire legacy question deserved, and at the time I thought it sounded almost noble. Decisive. A man who didn't want his death to turn into a circus. I had no idea what kind of clock that was about to become. Robert Kessler died 2 days later, Thursday, March the 5th, at 10 minutes past 7 in the evening, in his own bed, with me in the room. It wasn't dramatic. His heart had been failing for months, and it simply, finally, stopped doing the job. I called it. I made the calls you make, his physician, the funeral home, and Bruce Tannehill, because Robert had told me explicitly, in one of his last clear conversations, that the moment he died, the letter needed to be activated immediately. The clock started the second his heart did. I didn't know yet that the man I'd just called, the one I trusted to set this whole process in motion, already owed a very different kind of debt to someone with every reason to make sure that clock ran out. Welcome back to Sweet Family Revenge. Grab your snacks, get comfortable, and remember, the people in these stories had every chance to behave themselves. They just chose wrong. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. You're going to love it here. The next morning, Friday, I met Robert's niece's husband for the first time. Mark Stillwell, 47, married to Robert's niece Patty, showed up at the house before 9 a.m. You must be Daniel. He didn't wait for me to introduce myself. Patty's told me about you. Robert thought a lot of you, from what I hear. Grief looks a certain way. I've seen a lot of it. What Mark Stillwell had on his face wasn't grief. It was arithmetic. He shook my hand too hard, leaning against the kitchen counter like he had all the time in the world. We really do appreciate everything you did for Uncle Robert. He was a good man to work for. I'm sorry for your loss. Yeah, tragic. He didn't look like he meant either word. Then, almost too casually, you wouldn't happen to know anything about some letter, would you? Something Robert had Bruce draw up? I know there's a letter of intent. Robert explained the broad strokes. Details are between him and Bruce, far as I know. Right. His jaw tightened, just slightly. Of course. Why? Something wrong? No. No, just settling the estate. Lots of moving parts. He smiled, and it didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. You'll let us know if Bruce reaches out to you about anything, won't you? Sure, I didn't tell him Bruce already had. I didn't think much of it that morning. People act strange around death and money. I'd seen it dozens of times. What I didn't know yet was that Mark Stillwell had spent 2 years quietly siphoning money out of 3 failed business ventures, was roughly $400,000 underwater on debts that included a very specific, very dangerous obligation to a private poker operation running out of a warehouse off Front Street, and that the only thing standing between him and total collapse was his wife's expected inheritance, an inheritance that a confirmed blood heir could meaningfully shrink. I also didn't know that Bruce Tannehill had quietly covered $40,000 of those poker debts 8 months earlier. That arrangement was never about kindness. It was about leverage. And leverage, when the right 96 hours arrived, was about to get used. By Friday afternoon, I called the lab Bruce recommended, a private genetics facility on the south side of Toledo that handled court-admissible kinship testing, the kind whose results actually hold up in probate proceedings. I need to schedule a collection, I told the intake coordinator. It's tied to an active probate matter. There's a 96-hour deadline attached. Okay, let me just get your information. She took my name, my number, Bruce's referral code. Someone will call you back within the hour to schedule. Nobody called back that day, or the next morning. By Saturday at noon, 42 hours into a 96-hour clock, nearly half of it gone. I still hadn't given a single sample. I called again. Hi, I called yesterday about a rush collection, court deadline. I never heard back. Let me check. A pause, keys clicking. We're working on it. We'll be in touch. Can you tell me when? I have a window closing here. We'll be in touch. Same words, same flat delivery, like that sentence was the only one she had. That's when the feeling started, the one that sits behind your ribs and doesn't leave. Something about that voice felt less like a backed-up office and more like a door somebody was leaning against from the other side. I didn't know yet just how right that feeling was. By Saturday evening, 48 hours gone, half the clock already spent, I'd stopped being polite on the phone. I called the lab a 4th time. A woman who only gave her title, office coordinator, read off something that sounded scripted. The coordinator's voice was flat, like she was reading off a script. There was a scheduling conflict on our end. The earliest collection slot we have now is Monday afternoon. Monday afternoon? The deadline is Monday evening. Her tone suggested she didn't, in fact, understand at all. I understand your frustration, but that's the earliest we can do. I called Bruce Tannehill next. He picked up on the 4th ring, sounding distracted. Bruce, it's been 2 days, and they haven't even drawn my sample. Labs get backed up, Daniel. I'm monitoring the situation closely. You shouldn't have to worry about logistics, that's not really your department. It's a 96-hour clock, Bruce. Everything is my department right now. I hear you. I do. Let me make a call. When? Today, I promise. He didn't call. Not that day. Except, it was my department. It was the only department that mattered. Robert hadn't put my name on that letter so a lawyer could monitor it into oblivion. I drove to the lab myself Sunday morning, 8 a.m., Reynolds Road, and I stood at the front counter and asked, as politely as I could manage, why a court-mandated kinship test attached to an active 96-hour clause hadn't been collected almost 2 full days into that window. The technician at the desk, younger guy, clearly hadn't been told to lie convincingly, glanced at his screen and frowned. I'm not seeing a rush flag on this. It's logged as routine. Routine? Who logged it routine? He checked. Came through a referral code. Tied to a Bruce Tannehill, attorney of record. I stood in that lobby and felt something cold settle into my chest. Because that wasn't an accident. That was a decision. I need this drawn right now, I told him. And I need it flagged rush, court mandated, hard deadline, attorney of record, on file. In writing. And I'm recording you confirming that out loud, because I'm done trusting anybody's word on this. To his credit, he didn't argue. He drew the sample himself, flagged it rush, Said it out loud on my phone with a timestamp. Best case turnaround, he told me, was still 48 to 72 hours. I'd lost a day and a half I didn't have to spare, and I'd lost it because somebody with access to that referral wanted exactly that to happen. DNA alone wasn't going to be enough. Even a rushed result needed corroboration, something tying my mother's history to the sister Robert lost in 1958, because no judge was going to take a genetic match and a deathbed hunch and call it settled. I needed records, birth records, foster placement records, anything from Defiance County that could place a 6-year-old girl named Linda, separated from a family in 1958, into the same town where my mother turned up under a different family not long after. Robert had given me a name before he died, Susan Mabry, a longtime records clerk in the Defiance County office, who'd once helped his own investigators years earlier when he'd quietly tried and failed to track his sister's trail. Call her if it ever comes to this. Tell her I sent you. Some part of him already suspected he wouldn't live to finish it himself. So Sunday afternoon, 67 hours into the clock, I drove south on Route 24 toward Defiance, 59 miles, just under an hour, the city thinning out into flat winter farmland with the Maumee River keeping pace alongside the highway the whole way down. I called Susan from the road, explained who I was, what Robert had told me, what was riding on the 30 hours I had left. There was a long pause on the line, the kind that makes your stomach drop because you think you've lost her. Robert Kessler called me, you know. Back in 2019. Asked me almost the exact same questions you're asking now. Will you help me? That family deserved an answer 30 years ago. I'm not going to be the reason it doesn't happen now. Meet me at the office. I'll let you in. A records clerk, off the clock, unpaid on a Sunday, because she believed it mattered. I didn't forget that. She met me at the side door with a ring of keys and a flashlight, since the basement archive room didn't run on the same schedule as the rest of the building on weekends. How far back are we going? I asked. 1958, you said. These ledgers aren't digitized. Nobody's gotten around to it. We're doing this the hard way. I don't care how hard it is. Good, because it's a few hours of dust. Minimum, it took less than 2. We were 3 boxes in, going page by page through county guardianship filings that crumbled a little at the corners, when Susan stopped flipping and went still. Daniel, what, come look at this. A placement record for a 6-year-old girl, surname originally Kessler, placed into the care of a foster family in Defiance in October of 1958. Susan traced the line with one finger. There's a notation here. Surname formally changed the following year. To Brower. My mother's maiden name, the one nobody in my family ever talked about much. Wasn't her birth name at all. It was Brower because a foster family gave it to her in 1959, replacing the name she'd been born with, Kessler. I sat in that basement room with a 67-year-old ledger between us and felt something crack open in my chest that had nothing to do with money. Robert hadn't been chasing a hunch. He'd been right. You okay? Susan asked. Yeah, I wasn't. Not really. Can you certify copies of all of it? Today? Right now? Already pulling the machine out. Susan made certified copies of everything on the spot, the placement record, the name change filing, a supplemental guardianship document listing the birth parents' names, which matched down to the letter the parents Robert had described from his own childhood. I had it all by 6 p.m. Sunday, 71 hours gone, 25 left. I called Bruce from the parking lot to tell him what I'd found, mostly out of habit, mostly because some part of me still hadn't accepted what the lab silence actually meant. He sounded almost annoyed. Bring it by the office Monday. I'll review it for the filing. Monday? Bruce. The deadline is Monday evening. Why can't this just get filed the second I have both pieces in hand? There was a pause, just slightly too long to be nothing. Court filings have a process, Daniel. I'll handle it. I hung up in that parking lot with certified county records on the passenger seat and a sick, settling certainty in my gut that the man supposedly representing Robert's wishes had been working against them since the moment his heart stopped. I didn't sleep Sunday night. I sat at my kitchen table with the records spread out in front of me and started calling everyone I could think of. A probate clerk's after-hours line, a former coworker whose sister was a paralegal, anyone who could explain how DNA and document filings actually moved through Lucas County Probate Court when a hard deadline was attached. Attorneys of record have discretion over how filings get submitted on a case they control, the paralegal told me, somewhere around midnight. If he wants to stall, he can call it processes and review for hours, maybe longer, especially right up against closing time. Monday morning, the final day, the lab called. My results were back in 25 hours flat, beating even their own best case estimate, because the technician who'd flagged my sample personally pushed it through the weekend. Something he didn't have to do and did anyway. I'll be grateful for that for the rest of my life. Confirmed familial match, the woman on the phone read out. Consistent with an uncle and nephew relationship. Confidence level is conclusive for legal purposes. I had everything. The DNA, the records, 71 hours of work compressed into documentation that should have made this simple. I drove straight to Bruce's downtown office at 9 a.m. Monday morning, 10 hours and 10 minutes before the deadline, and walked in with all of it in a folder under my arm. Bruce stepped out for a personal matter, his assistant told me. He's not expected back until early afternoon. I sat in that lobby and watched the clock on the wall, and somewhere underneath the panic, a different feeling started to take its place. Something steadier. Something that had stopped being surprised and started being ready. Bruce Tannehill walked back into his office at 1:15 Monday afternoon, 6 hours before the deadline. No apology, just, did you have a chance to review the filing timeline? I'd had more than a chance. I'd had 2 days of his silence, working against a dying man's request. And I was done pretending I didn't know what that silence had been doing. I want the petition filed today. Both the DNA report and the certified Defiance County records attached. Filed. Bruce. Not reviewed. Not run through whatever timeline you've invented. Filed. Before the courthouse closes at 4:30. That's not how this works, Daniel. There's proper procedure. I'd need to draft a formal motion. Get it reviewed, Bruce. These things can't be rushed. Is that what you're about to say to me? He didn't answer that. That's when Mark Stillwell walked in. Not by accident. I understood that the second I saw the look that passed between him and Bruce, a look that had clearly been rehearsed over a phone call neither of them thought I'd ever trace. Mark sat down across from me, uninvited, almost gently, like he was doing me a favor. Daniel, look, these family situations get complicated. Robert was very sick near the end. A notarized letter written by a man on heavy medication might not hold up the way you think it will. Maybe the cleanest thing, for everybody, including you, is to let the existing will stand. Revisit the family question after probate closes. After probate closes. After the 96 hours expire. After the only window that actually matters slams shut for good. I understood, sitting there, that I wasn't looking at two separate problems. I was looking at one. A nephew-in-law $400,000 underwater on a poker debt, and an attorney who'd quietly paid $40,000 of it himself, both of them with everything to gain from a clock running out in their favor. I didn't raise my voice. 11 years of staying level in rooms where everyone else is losing their grip. That training held. I have a court-admissible DNA report. I have certified county records corroborating a 67-year-old family separation. And I have a notarized letter of intent signed by a man of sound enough mind to also sign off on medical directives, financial documents, and a property transfer that same week, documents nobody's contesting. With or without your help, Bruce. Mark leaned back, arms crossed. You really think a judge is going to drop everything for you on a Monday afternoon? I think a judge is going to drop everything for a 96-hour clause her own court already has on file. We're about to find out. Bruce's face did something complicated. Mark's didn't change at all, which told me everything about which one of them had more to lose. I drove to the Lucas County Courthouse on Adams Street myself, 2 hours and 40 minutes before the doors closed for the day. Bruce, to his limited credit, came along, guilt or self-preservation. I couldn't say and honestly didn't care which. We reached the probate clerk's window at 2:50. The clerk scanned the letter of intent, Frowning, "There's a deficiency here. The notarized letter needs a supplemental affidavit from the notary, confirming the circumstances of the signing. Without it, I can't accept this as complete." I turned to Bruce. "Did you file that?" He didn't meet my eyes. I never followed up on it. Whether that was negligence or sabotage by omission, I'll let you draw your own conclusion. Almost sympathetic, Judge Reed's chambers close at 4:30. It's 3:10 now, an hour and 20 minutes to track down a notary on a Monday afternoon with no notice. I called the notary's office listed on the original document, a small storefront on Sylvania Avenue. The woman who'd notarized Robert's letter, Patricia, wasn't in. Doctor's appointment, back at 4. I left a message that probably sounded more like a plea than a professional request, and started driving towards Sylvania Avenue anyway, because sitting still wasn't an option anymore. That's when my phone rang, a number I didn't recognize. "Mr. Wexler? My name's Renee Castillo. I did some paralegal work for Robert Kessler over the years, small personal matters, outside Bruce's office." Her voice had an edge of urgency to it. "He mailed me something the week before he died. A sealed letter, addressed to whoever ends up needing this. Told me not to open it unless I heard he'd passed and that things got complicated. I saw the obituary this morning. I opened it. What's in it?" Her voice still had that edge of urgency. "You need to hear this in person. I'm 15 minutes from the courthouse right now." Inside the envelope she handed me 20 minutes later was a letter in Robert's own handwriting, dated the same day as the notarized letter of intent. "I don't fully trust the process to move cleanly," it read. "I've watched too many estates get tangled in self-interested delay to believe this one won't. So I'm leaving a second piece of evidence, specifically so that if anyone tries to claim a technicality or a procedural failure, there's no question left to argue." Folded inside was a sealed, sterile swab, self-collected, dated and witnessed by his physician that same week, with a notarized statement confirming it as his own genetic sample, prepared for exactly this scenario. Robert hadn't just believed me. He'd prepared for the exact moment someone would try to make sure belief wasn't enough. I called the courthouse clerk directly. "I have a second, independently witnessed sample, directly from the deceased chain of custody intact. Can that be presented as supplementary evidence even without the affidavit?" "At the judge's discretion. Given the deadline on file, get here." 4:11. 19 minutes on the clock. I drove straight to the courthouse. Judge Nancy Reed agreed to a brief in-chambers review, given the documented court-recognized deadline. Unusual, her clerk told me later, but not unheard of in cases with a formally notarized, time-bound clause attached. I stood in that chamber with Bruce fidgeting beside me and laid it all out: the DNA report, the Defiance County records, the notarized letter of intent, and now the sealed sample and handwritten letter Robert left behind specifically anticipating obstruction. The judge reviewed it in near silence. 4 minutes felt like 40. "Mr. Tannehill," she didn't look up from the documents. "Explain to me why a routine supplemental affidavit tied to a six-figure estate's time-sensitive filing was never completed in over 2 months since this letter was signed." Bruce didn't have an answer that held up under that kind of silence. 4:26. 4 minutes before close, the filing is accepted. Citing the corroborating physician, witnessed sample as sufficient supplementary documentation, given the unusual but legally sound 96-hour clause Mr. Kessler himself insisted on. Estate distribution is paused pending formal confirmation. Confirmation came back 2 weeks later, exactly as the lab and the county records had already told me it would. I am, by blood, Robert Kessler's nephew. My mother Linda was the 6-year-old girl he never stopped looking for. Mark Stillwell's gambling debts came out in full during the probate proceedings that followed, not because I went looking for them, but because Bruce Tannehill, facing a state bar inquiry into the mishandled affidavit and the suspiciously routine lab referral, decided his own exposure mattered more than Mark's secrets. Bruce surrendered his license to practice rather than fight the inquiry. Mark and Patty Stillwell remained named in the will, the way Robert had always intended, just no longer as the only names that mattered. I didn't take the company. I didn't want it. And Robert, it turned out, hadn't expected me to. What he'd wanted, more than money, was for somebody from that 1958 split to finally know the truth and be acknowledged by it. I used a portion of what came to me to fund a wing renovation at the hospice facility where I still work 2 days a week, because the job was never about the money, and I wasn't about to let money change that. And I drove back down to Defiance one more time, with flowers, to sit with Susan Mabry in that same basement records room and thank her properly for staying on a Sunday for a stranger, because she thought a family deserved an answer. Robert Kessler spent 67 years carrying the weight of a 6-year-old he couldn't protect. He didn't get to finish making it right himself. But he made sure, down to a sealed swab and a handwritten letter mailed to a near stranger, that somebody else could finish it for him. That's the part I think about most, not the money. The 96 hours a dying man spent making absolutely certain that the people determined to stop the truth wouldn't get the chance. If you liked this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more family-centered accounts like this.